Did you know that in the North Pole, there isn't even a single astronomical telescope, while the South Pole is filled with astronomical instruments and powerful telescopes like the South Pole Telescope? This is a simple question, but its answer is very complicated, shocking, and completely unexpected. But really, why? Why is it that in a place that should apparently be the best spot for stargazing, not a single telescope has been installed? Could there be a scientific secret involved? Or maybe military, political, or even geographical reasons? Alright, let's get to the heart of the story. Imagine standing on a massive icy mountain in the North Pole on a winter night. Everywhere is dark, there's no light at all, and the sky is filled with stars. The sound of the polar wind whistles in your ears, and you want just one thing, a telescope, so you can capture this unparalleled beauty at any moment. Now the main question is, if the sky at the North Pole is so clear, the air so dry, and the surroundings so dark, then why hasn't anyone built a telescope there to observe the sky? The answer to this simple question is unbelievably fascinating. In fact, the answer is a strange mix of science, politics, nature, and a bit of madness. First of all, let's learn a bit more about this place. The North Pole, contrary to what you might think, isn't a dry, icy surface like the South Pole. Here it's actually an ocean covered with ice, meaning there's water beneath all that ice, and that makes a huge difference. Meanwhile, the South Pole is an actual landmass with over 2 kilometers of ice sitting on top of it, so you can actually build structures there. But in the North Pole, there's no such stability to allow for construction on top of it. In fact, the ice at the North Pole is constantly moving. This means that if you build a telescope at a certain spot in the North Pole today, a few months later, there's no telling where that telescope will be. Even worse, the base of the telescope itself won't last on the ice. Let me tell you something. Telescopes usually have 2 major types of problems, both of which can reduce the quality of astronomical observations: light pollution and optical degradation. Simply put, in special conditions like the North Pole, telescopes are actually under pressure from 2 sides. On one side from excess ambient light, and on the other from atmospheric issues that disrupt the telescope's precise view. Have you noticed how people say desert nights are better for stargazing? So why is that? Because in the desert, the sky is darker and there's no extra light from city lamps, cars, streets, or even industrial lights. So light pollution refers to the presence of excess light in the sky around telescopes, which causes stars and celestial objects to appear dimmer than they actually are. The reason is that when there's too much ambient light, the telescope can't distinguish celestial objects clearly. But what is optical degradation? This issue relates to the image quality or optical precision of telescopes. For example, in the North Pole, due to specific atmospheric and environmental conditions, telescopes may face issues like ice and ice crystals forming on the surface of the lens or the telescope's mirrors. As a result, these ice formations prevent light from entering the telescope properly, causing distortion in the image. That is, instead of light from outer space reaching the telescope accurately, ice or moisture can deflect or dim the light. It's interesting to know that, in fact, in the North Pole, the cold and unstable air actually causes something called severe atmospheric turbulence. This means that the light coming from the stars wobbles and becomes wavy as it passes through the Earth's atmosphere, which makes the image of the stars appear distorted. Therefore, unlike the South Pole, which has dry and relatively calm air, the North Pole constantly experiences strong and warm or cold winds that ruin the image. But another reason why there are no telescopes at the North Pole is that the North Pole has no permanent roads, no airport, no power station, or even a support center. Everything there is either mobile, like the temporary research stations of the Russians and Canadians, or is melting. Nevertheless, advanced astronomical equipment requires electricity, internet, a technical team, and maintenance. So, the issue here isn't just a scientific limitation. Building astronomical equipment at the North Pole really isn't practical either. Even if you want to go there with icebreaker ships, you only have access for a few weeks each year. In winter, it's impossible to go to the North Pole at all, because at that time the temperature is minus 50 degrees, and on top of that, there's a wind blowing at 100 kilometers per hour. Now here's a really interesting point about observing stars. You need to be able to see a large portion of the night sky, but the North Pole is located at such a high geographic latitude that you can only see a small part of the sky. This means that in reality, telescopes can only track certain orbits. For example, if you consider telescopes that are installed near the equator, you have much broader access to the sky. But at the North Pole, telescopes' access to the sky is completely limited. But an even more interesting point is that, in recent years, the South Pole has become a paradise for scientists compared to the North Pole. That is, permanent buildings like Amundsen Scott's South Pole Station, and telescopes such as BICEP and the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory are located there. And because the ground is stable, the sky is calmer, and the United States has a strong presence and has invested there, research is more practical in that location. Meanwhile, in the North Pole, the territories are divided among countries like Russia, Canada, Norway, and the United States. No one has complete control, and this means that long-term projects in such a shared region become very difficult. Now, aside from the reasons we've mentioned, there are also some other theories about why there are no telescopes at the North Pole. For example, one political theory suggests that because ownership of the North Pole has not yet been definitively determined among the countries, no one is willing to establish an international scientific base there. On top of that, the situation becomes even more complicated from an economic perspective. Maintaining extremely sensitive equipment in a region that is always cold and full of ice storms requires both a huge amount of money and very advanced technology. But perhaps the most interesting theory is the military and espionage aspect of the story. Some people believe that the North Pole has more military use than scientific, because beneath those polar ice sheets, nuclear submarines from certain countries secretly travel back and forth, and building a telescope there might interfere with the security interests of some countries. Of course, these are all just theories, and there isn't much solid evidence to fully prove them yet. Now imagine, with all the troubles and challenges we mentioned, what it would be like to build a telescope at the North Pole. One day, all the obstacles are removed and technology advances so much that a telescope is built that can keep itself stable on the Arctic ice. It calibrates itself precisely using GPS, is powered by solar energy, and connects to satellites. A telescope that is not afraid of the cold, nor the ice, nor the Earth's magnetic fluctuations. Like a silent and precise astronaut, it just gazes at the sky in the middle of endless snow and observes everything. Of course, I should mention that there are a few research teams who are thinking about this issue. There have even been projects like France's Tread Arctic, where they tested a small telescope on the ice. But we think that in the future, a large, advanced, and precise telescope might be built in the North Pole. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments section. But overall, the combination of all the factors and challenges we've mentioned has led to the North Pole being removed from the list of scientific locations. Nevertheless, nothing is impossible. Sometimes the absence of something in a place says more than its presence. The North Pole may seem quiet and empty, but behind this silence lies a complex world, and science is always searching for a way. Maybe one day, with future technologies, we'll build floating telescopes on the North Pole. But until that day, all we can do is look up at the sky and wonder, if there's so much up there, then why is there nothing happening down here?